The year was 1917, and the First World War had put Russia under unbearable strain. The losses at the front were enormous. In the cities, mismanagement of the economy had led to rising prices and food shortages. In the carriage of the imperial train in Pskov, senior politicians and generals told Tsar Nicholas II that he must abdicate, or Russia would descend into anarchy and lose the war. Nicholas accepts and abdicates the throne in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael. But Michael, realizing the gravity of the moment, refused to accept the crown. This put an end to the 304-year reign of the Romanov Dynasty. On November 1st, 1894, Nicholas II ascended the Russian throne after the death of his father, Alexander III. His reign became synonymous with weak leadership and disastrous decisions that quickly made him unpopular with the Russian people. One of his first failures came in 1904, when he led Russia into a reckless war with Japan in an attempt to expand the empire eastward. The conflict ended in humiliating defeat. The Russians decided they had suffered enough. Just a few months after the war ended, in January 1905, discontent in the country reached its peak. Thousands of protesters, men, women, and children, headed to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, carrying placards and demanding political reform. Instead of listening to his people, the Tsar sends his troops against them. Guns blare and the streets turn red. Over 100 people die on the spot, and hundreds more are wounded. History will remember this day as Bloody Sunday. If Nicholas II was simply unpopular until then, he is now hated. It is a wound that will never heal. This carnage triggered the 1905 revolution, which forced Nicholas to create the State Duma, a representative body supposedly to give voice to the people. But it soon became clear that the Tsar had no intention of sharing power. Whenever the Duma dared to challenge his decisions, he dissolved it without hesitation, an act that deepens the distrust between the crown and the people. As if his reign no longer hung in the balance, Nicholas made one final disastrous decision. He took direct control of the military in World War I. If the Russo-Japanese conflict was a mistake, it was a veritable death sentence. Russia was unprepared for a clash of this magnitude. Soldiers were sent to the front without enough weapons and were forced to take the rifles of the dead. At the same time, famine was eating away at the people of the country. Women replaced men in the factories who had gone to war. Then the people gave their ruler a new name, Nicholas the Bloody. Though incompetent as a ruler, Nicholas was a devoted father and husband. He adored his wife Alexandra and their 5 children, 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, known as the Grand Duchesses of Russia, and 1 son, Alexei, the heir to the throne. But there was one huge problem. Alexei was born with hemophilia, a life-threatening blood disease that prevents blood from clotting. In an age when medicine could offer no cure, it was a sentence that threatened not only his life, but the stability of the dynasty. It was the desperate need to preserve Alexei's life that drove Alexandra straight into the arms of a man who would become one of the most sinister and controversial figures in Russian history, Grigori Rasputin. A self-proclaimed holy man from Siberia, Rasputin works his way into the confidence of the royal family, claiming he can ease Alexei's suffering with his mysterious healing abilities. No one can say for sure whether it was divine power, hypnosis, or pure luck. But every time Alexei fell into critical hemorrhages, Rasputin, in some inexplicable way, managed to alleviate the boy's suffering. Rasputin's influence on the royal family was further strengthened when he allegedly predicted that Alexei's survival was inextricably linked to the fate of the Romanov Dynasty. This prophecy deepened Alexandra's dependence on him. Thus, a country mystic became a confidant of the empress and won the favor of the king himself. For the Russian people, this was a national scandal, for it now seemed that the fate of the empire was in the hands of a man whom they regarded as a charlatan, a devil wrapped in religious robes. Rasputin was assassinated in 1916 by Russian patriots, but there are versions that there were much deeper plots and connections behind the assassination of him. In March 1917, there were reports of the imminent introduction of food rationing. This sparked unrest across Russia and set the stage for the fall of the Romanov Dynasty. Even before this, however, the country had been suffering food shortages for months. This time, however, the news overflowed the cup of popular patience. Hunger knows no mercy, and when a mother sees her children hungry, neither law, ruler, nor empire can stop her. On 8th March, International Women's Day, thousands of women take to the streets demanding bread and an end to royal rule. By nightfall, over 100,000 protesters flooded the streets of Petrograd. Seeing the situation, the People's Duma offers Nicholas a lifeline before it is too late. They ask him to form a government that the people can trust. But the Tsar was a man who had grown up believing in the divine right of a monarch. He had been chosen by God to rule, and compromise was not in his nature. Instead of negotiating, he sent the troops to put down the rebellion. And it is here that he makes perhaps his most fatal mistake. There was no enemy army standing against the soldiers. They were looking into the faces of their own mothers, sisters, and wives. This is a line that many refuse to cross. One by one, the soldiers lowered their weapons. Some even joined the protesters. And so the Tsar's iron grip on Russia turns to ashes. The unrest spirals out of control, and Nicholas is forced to return to Petrograd. As he makes his way home, the situation at the Alexander Palace becomes increasingly critical. The Speaker of the Duma advises Alexandra and her 5 children to flee to protect themselves, but as the children were suffering from measles, she refused to leave. Meanwhile, the palace's power and water supplies were cut off, and as more soldiers deserted, the imperial family began to be left unprotected against the growing chaos outside. 7 days later, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate under pressure from the Duma, which took control to restore order. He refused to hand over the throne to his ailing son Alexei and named his brother, Prince Michael, as heir. The next day, under pressure from revolutionary forces, Michael refuses the crown, ending the long reign of the Romanov Dynasty and setting Russia on a new path. Meanwhile, frantic efforts began to secure a refuge for the imperial family, with Britain initially offering one through King George V, Nicholas's first cousin. But the king's political advisors warned him that taking in the Romanovs could inflame public discontent at home. The last thing the king wants is a revolution in his own country. And so the offer is quietly withdrawn. One by one, the doors of Europe are closing on the Romanovs, leaving them completely isolated and without a way out. On 21st March, just a day before Nikolai is to be reunited with his family, Alexandra is informed that she and her husband have been formally placed under arrest. The children and household staff remain with them, but the new government fears what might happen if the Romanovs remain in Petrograd. Outside, the revolution is still raging, and while the former rulers are around, they could become a symbol for those who still support the monarchy. That is why it was decided in August that they should be moved away from the center of power. Their exile took them to Tobolsk, deep in the heart of Siberia. There in the governor's residence, they are still captives, but life is milder. They are allowed to take some of their luxuries with them, and nearly 40 loyal servants willingly follow them into exile. But if history has taught us anything, it is that when a ruler falls, mercy is rare. What begins as house arrest soon takes on a much darker character. The revolution is not over, and for the Romanovs, the worst is yet to come. After the October Revolution, the new leader of the Soviet government, Vladimir Lenin, planned to put Nikolai on trial. An official was sent to Tobolsk to accompany Nikolai to Moscow for the trial. However, the Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg strongly opposed this plan and insisted that the Tsar be handed over to them. Eventually, the Kremlin sided with the Bolsheviks, and Nicholas, along with his wife Alexandra and one of their daughters, were transported to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. On their arrival there, they were imprisoned in the Ipatiev House, also called the House of Special Purpose. A high wooden wall was erected around the building to isolate the occupants from the outside world. The remaining children were brought to their parents a month later. In mid-1918, the White Army, a military force loyal to the Tsar, advanced on Yekaterinburg to rescue the Tsarist family. Fearing they might be released, the Bolsheviks made a quick and brutal decision. In the early hours of July 17th, Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, their 5 children, 4 servants and the family doctor, Yevgeny Botkin, are awakened by their guards on the pretext that they will be moved to a safer place. They are all taken to the cellar of the house, where minutes later, a group of heavily armed men, led by Yakov Jurowski, enter. Wasting no time, Yurovsky reads aloud the death sentence announcing that the Romanovs have been sentenced to execution. On his orders, the executioners open fire. The room fills with the sound of thunder and panicked screams. But the horror does not end there. After the smoke clears, it becomes clear that the daughters, by some miracle, are still breathing. The executioners expected them to fall after the first volley, but something was wrong. The bullets ricocheted off them, only superficially injuring them. It wasn't luck, though. It was diamonds. Knowing that one day they might have to flee, the Romanovs had sewn their most precious jewels into their corsets. What was supposed to be their insurance for survival was now only prolonging their agony. When the executioners realized what was happening, the bayonets were removed and everything became even more violent. This horror lasted 20 minutes. Essentially, the plan was simple: kill everyone quickly, burn the evidence, and bury what was left. But nothing about that night was that simple. The special purpose home had done its job. The Romanov dynasty no longer existed. After the family was finally eliminated, the Bolsheviks mocked the fallen royalty, looted their treasures, and began arguing about how to dispose of their remains. Their incompetence quickly becomes apparent. They load the remains into a truck, which turns out to be damaged, forcing them to haul them into a nearby forest. There they remove and burn the royals' clothes before throwing the rest into a mine shaft, all only to find that it is too shallow. Panicked and facing strict orders to leave no trace, Jacob and his men desperately search for a solution. They leave the wreckage unattended and rush back to town to procure the necessary materials. For 3 days and nights, Yurovsky makes chaotic attempts to erase the evidence. Eventually, he separates the remains into 2 different pits, hoping this trick will prevent future discoveries. In order to control public opinion and to avoid the anger of the people at the murder of the Tsar's children, the Bolsheviks announced publicly that they had abolished only Nicholas II. This led to widespread speculation that some of the Romanovs had survived. Over the years, various individuals have come forward claiming to be the lost heir Alexei or Grand Duchess Anastasia. Some even insist that they are the rightful heirs to the Romanov fortune, which is rumored and speculated to be sitting locked up in Swiss banks even today. The remains of the Romanov family were discovered secretly in 1979, but remained hidden until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. When the remains were later examined, genetic tests confirmed their identity. Writing the final chapter in the tragic history of the Romanov dynasty took nearly a century. Shortly before the 2000th year, Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their 3 daughters finally rest in the tombs of St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Their remains now sit alongside those of almost all Russian rulers since Peter the Great. But the story is not yet fully complete. 2 of the Romanovs' children, Maria and Alexei, were missing from the funeral. Later, in 2007, their remains were discovered, hidden in unmarked graves, but to this day, they have not been buried with the rest of the family. The Russian Orthodox Church is hesitant to accept modern science and is pushing for more tests and evidence. Although over 100 years have passed since that evil night in Yekaterinburg, some names remain too big to be forgotten by history. Though the Soviet Union has collapsed and the executioners have long since rotted into the ground, the shadows of the Romanovs continue to roam among us today. If you want to go further back in the history of the Russian rulers, then don't miss our account of the story of Ivan the Terrible and his secret library in the video you see on the left.